Welcome to American Aftermath. Tonight we'll trace the entire story of Hurricane Katrina. When the water kept rising, streets turned to rivers, thousands waited in the heat for rescue, and a country watched an American city drown on live television. We'll move slowly and keep a steady, patient pace. We'll take our time. We'll stay close to the people who lived it and to the quiet ways this story still touches American life today. Before we begin, if you find comfort in these calm retellings of the days that broke and reshaped America, you're welcome to subscribe. And if you'd like, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Let the room dim. Settle back. Breathe with the soft night hum, and let the day drift as tonight's story begins. In the years before Hurricane Katrina, life along the Gulf felt practiced around water. People measured seasons by heat, rain, and the pull of tides. Families fished, worked docks, and cooked what the marsh gave. Music carried through porches on slow nights. School calendars bent around storm days that often passed without harm. Levees ringed neighborhoods and pumps labored after cloudbursts. Many trusted that the barriers would hold. Risk was not ignored, yet it fit into daily habit. Insurance papers sat in drawers with birth certificates. Evacuation routes were printed on fridge magnets. The shipping channel kept work moving. Oil and gas crews rode crew boats before dawn. Tourists wandered the quarter, bought beignets, and listened to brass bands. The coast felt both fragile and durable, like an old house near a river. People knew the maps but hoped the hard lines would bend for them. The river set pace. Along the low country, land and water traded edges in quiet ways. Marsh spread outward like a rough quilt stitched with bayous. Barrier islands took the first push of Gulf wind. Cypress roots held soil where they could. Canals cut through for boats and for drainage. The ground sank in places as peat dried and settled. Streets in some neighborhoods sat below nearby lakes. People learned which corners flooded after a summer cloudburst. Builders raised houses on piers when budgets allowed. Seafood filled ice chests on weekends. Guides baited lines for visitors who chased redfish at dawn. Work crews mended nets and welded steel near heat that shimmered. The port kept trains and ships moving in a long chain. In that landscape, Hurricane Katrina would arrive as weather and as a test. It would meet old decisions, and those choices would shape what came next. People felt both ready sometimes. Levees shaped daily trust in the city and the parishes nearby. Earthen walls rose beside canals and along lake edges. Concrete floodwalls stood over grass that children cut in summer. Pump stations lifted water toward the lake after heavy rain. The system grew over decades of projects and bonds. Engineers set heights and slopes based on old storms and available funds. Maintenance crews walked crowns and checked for animal burrows. Homeowners saw mowed embankments and felt steadier. Some walls followed lines set by navigation needs. Ship channels and drainage canals shared space with neighborhoods. When the tide ran high, gates closed and workers watched gauges. The design assumed storms that looked like the past. The gaps opened by growth and cost were not simple to see. Under those expectations, Hurricane Katrina would press the structure wide. The pressure would expose weak links and change what people believed. for many households. Memories of earlier storms shaped what people thought they knew. Elders talked about Betsy and about the long rebuild that followed. Others kept stories of Camille in family albums. These names lived beside photos of weddings and parades. Sirens and forecasts came each season, and most years brought only worry. People taped windows and filled bathtubs out of habit. Some owned cars and could leave with hours to spare. Others shared rides or counted on neighbors. Many could not afford hotels far from home. Pets and caregiving needs added hard choices. Employers sometimes expected a quick return after a false alarm. Police and firefighters trained for wind and street flooding. School gyms served as known gathering points. Churches kept phone trees for rides and prayer lists. Against that long routine, Hurricane Katrina would ask more than a day of patience. It would ask for distance and time. For many families, daily life carried a rhythm that felt rooted in place. Mornings began with coffee and the smell of bread at corner shops. Buses traced familiar routes down broad avenues. Second lines wound through streets on bright Sundays. Church bells marked hours and set gatherings in motion. Children learned to shout for the saints and to dance at school fairs. Tourists filled balconies and asked directions with open maps. Chefs worked long nights and squeezed lemons into gumbo pots. Teachers decorated rooms with cut paper and taped art to walls. Musicians tuned horns and waited for the first call. Gardeners trimmed camellias in shaded yards. The quarter drew crowds while quieter neighborhoods looked after their own. Under that routine, Hurricane Katrina was a name on a forecast map. It sounded like risk, but also like many storms before it. People went on with chores and plans, dinner tables filled with talk. The region's work tied local streets to national supply lines. Barges moved grain and steel through the port. Containers stacked like bright blocks under cranes. Refineries sent fuel along pipelines toward distant cities. Fishing boats brought shrimp to markets before sunrise. Small shops sold ice and rubber boots near the docks. Charter companies hired deckhands when the bite turned strong. Hotels booked conventions through the fall. Bands played to travelers who returned each year. Wages rose and fell with oil prices and storm seasons. Insurance policies set premiums that shaped where people lived. New homes climbed on higher pilings when owners could pay. Old homes stayed low because money ran thin. Crews patched roofs after summer squalls and then stood down. In that economy, Hurricane Katrina threatened more than houses. It threatened paychecks, schools, clinics, and the web of work that kept bills current. Families counted on steady routines together. Emergency plans outlined roles for city, parish, and state. Police would manage traffic flows on outbound routes. Firefighters would handle calls until winds made response unsafe. The Coast Guard would stage for water rescues if needed. The National Guard would support logistics when local crews tired. The Superdome stood as a shelter of last resort. Hospitals kept generators and fuel on site. Nursing homes kept paper plans near the front desk. Radio systems linked agencies across parish lines. Drills had tested parts of the system in calmer months. Some lessons turned into new checklists. Other gaps waited for a hard day to reveal them. Communication trees depended on working phones and power. Bus fleets and drivers depended on clear orders and timing. In that framework, Hurricane Katrina would push every link at once. The plan would matter, but so would neighbors and spare boats. Small choices would carry weight everywhere. Forecasts were a familiar sound on late summer radios. Meteorologists spoke in careful tones about cones and surge. People listened while folding clothes or driving home. Local anchors became trusted voices during storm weeks. Forecast tracks changed with each new advisory. Many learned not to panic at the first line on the map. Businesses checked insurance and watched the models. City crews cleared catch basins before heavy rain. Levee boards met on budgets and maintenance priorities. Debates about taxes and jurisdiction slowed some work. Contracts moved forward in steps that took time. Homeowners saw crews mowing and felt things were steady. In that atmosphere, Hurricane Katrina began as another alert. The name stood beside others that never came close. The repetition made calm feel reasonable. Yet water seeks openings and waits for weather. The season held more heat than memory wanted to admit. Small signals gathered in quiet places nearby. Housing patterns shaped who could leave quickly and who could not. Renters waited for landlords to make plans. Public housing residents watched for notices from managers. Elderly neighbors counted on family or church vans. People with chronic illness lined up medications and oxygen tanks. Pet owners faced rules at many shelters. Some kept credit cards with enough room for travel. Others lived paycheck to paycheck and had limited options. Bus stations filled when storms approached. Gas prices rose at crowded pumps. Traffic turned interstates into long lines of idling cars. Patience was a resource that cost energy and time. Paychecks could be lost if shifts were missed. Students worried about missed exams and band practice. The web of obligations made choices hard. Against that set of limits, Hurricane Katrina would become a sharper line. The storm would turn routine plans into a much harder test. Many felt choice grow narrow. Late August carried heat that lifted from streets in waves. Classrooms had reopened and lockers clicked between bells. High school teams practiced in the late light. The Saints played preseason games that pulled friends to living rooms. Garden hoses ran into kiddie pools for toddlers. Air conditioners hummed behind windows at dusk. Restaurants stocked for weekend crowds and set extra tables. Bartenders filled ice bins and cut limes. Streetcars rattled and sent sparks under the wires. Ferry decks smelled of river wind. Newly hired nurses learned routes to wards across town. Crews painted lines on roads near fresh repairs. The week felt busy and normal in many places. The forecast gave Hurricane Katrina a growing presence on the screen. It shared space with bills and chores and end-of-month tasks. Updates landed like reminders that routine can move and tilt without warning. People watched, then returned to tasks nearby. The coast stood on the edge of a wide idea of safety. People believed in work and in one another. They believed that walls and pumps would buy time to act. They believed that a city could manage water with craft and care. That trust was not naive. It grew from years when storms bent away or lost power over marsh. It grew from long effort by crews who patched, tested, and showed up. It grew from neighbors who kept spare keys and extra food. It grew from music and parades that gathered people in hard times. It grew from the slow rebuilds after older storms. Hurricane Katrina would meet that layered trust and find its limits. The hours before landfall would stretch choices thin. Phones would ring and routes would fill. As the shift from waiting to leaving began, a larger test drew near. The coast held its breath. In the final days before landfall, Hurricane Katrina moved through the Gulf while forecasts tightened and warnings spread. Models that had pointed wide began to agree on a path toward the central Gulf Coast. Each new advisory felt closer to home as the cone narrowed and watches appeared on screens. Air felt heavy over water and over streets that had seen many near misses. Families refreshed pages, checked fuel, and asked neighbors about rides. Officials listened to briefings and weighed how soon to ask people to go. The memory of past seasons offered comfort and also a warning about time. As Saturday turned to Sunday, Hurricane Katrina drew a clearer line toward Louisiana and Mississippi. The turn toward land meant choices could not wait. People who had planned to leave on short notice began to pack for longer absences. Those who managed clinics and shelters reviewed lists and called staff through the night. Radio voices kept a steady tone while repeating the same plain guidance. People tried to rest nearby. After crossing South Florida as a weaker system, Hurricane Katrina entered very warm water and began to gather strength. Forecasters watched the wind fields expand and the core organize over the central Gulf. Advisories described pressure falls that told a simple story about energy and risk. The track guidance shifted only slightly with each run, which raised confidence in the target zone. Meteorologists kept reminding listeners that a cone is not a line and that surge travels where water can go. Onshore, emergency managers began to move resources toward staging areas and to speak in clearer terms. Nursing homes compared transport contracts with the availability of drivers willing to work through the weekend. The mood held steady in many households, yet the weight of preparation grew with every bulletin. Phone trees lit up across churches and social clubs that had weathered earlier seasons. Families with relatives inland checked spare rooms, couches, and fold-out beds. People near water looked at maps to judge bridges, ferries, and the time routes might take. By Saturday morning, Hurricane Katrina had become the lead story across the Gulf states and on national networks. Weather offices issued stronger statements that urged action rather than watchful waiting. Emergency declarations opened funds and cleared the way for broader orders. Parish leaders discussed curfews for neighborhoods that would empty after evacuations. State police and highway crews prepared contraflow plans to turn interstates into streams moving away from the coast. The phrase that this could be a very serious storm repeated in every briefing. People who had stayed through many named systems felt the difference in tone and pace. Small towns along bays and sounds posted evacuation times on handwritten boards near gas stations. Volunteers lined up at shelters to set cots and to organize intake tables. Hospitals reassessed generator fuel and reviewed lists of patients who could be moved. Newscasts showed empty shelves where water had stood, offering a familiar picture to many viewers. Under louder warnings, the storm felt abstract to some because skies were clear at noon. On Sunday morning, Hurricane Katrina pushed leaders in New Orleans to issue the first citywide mandatory evacuation in memory. Buses were called into service for people without cars, and the Superdome opened as a shelter of last resort. Lines formed under a sun while officials checked bags and gave out wristbands. Residents who could leave by highway moved during the morning to beat the tide of traffic. Contraflow turned lanes outbound, and patrol cars held intersections so flows would not stall. Radio stations repeated the pickup points and urged patience for slow buses and crowded ramps. Hospitals made triage lists for transfers while others prepared to shelter in place with teams for long shifts. Nursing homes checked head counts and loaded wheelchairs into vans as drivers arrived. Airlines added flights when possible and shut down operations as winds climbed. Shelter workers received families with pets in carriers and tried to match them with posted rules. By afternoon, many neighborhoods felt empty, and others kept a few holdouts behind closed doors. Along the Mississippi coast, Hurricane Katrina drew a wide arc of warnings that reached from bay to bay. Local officials walked through marinas and urged boat owners to move or secure their craft. Casino barges sealed doors and reduced staff to essential crews. Beach towns pulled flags from piers and posted closures along boardwalks and parking lots. Inland, shelters opened in school gyms and churches with long cinder block halls. Traffic moved north on familiar highways, and families chose roads based on fuel and rest stops. Neighbors checked on older residents and helped load ice chests and photographs into cars. In Biloxi and Gulfport, windows were boarded as crews worked fast over warm pavement. Storm surge maps circulated again, and people traced the lines back to their blocks and yards. Some moved valuables to attics, which felt wise but also risky if water rose too high. Officials repeated that evacuation meant vertical safety first, not preservation of property. As night neared, the coast settled into a waiting posture built from practice. Forecasts for Hurricane Katrina highlighted surge as a central threat because the track and size favored long fetch. Meteorologists explained that water piles up for hours and follows contours more than wind. They urged attention to bays, passes, and lakes that can funnel volume into narrow places. Engineers briefed leaders on expected stresses to walls along canals and around pump stations. Drainage crews checked backups and moved spare parts to the sites most likely to flood. A wider audience learned what a watch meant and when a warning would replace it. Graphics showed the cone beside county lines to help families picture distance and time. Talk shifted from chance to readiness as decisions quickened while phones kept ringing. Dispatch centers staffed extra radios and set paper logs to capture requests if computers failed. Hospital administrators checked roof access for helicopters and confirmed contacts with ground ambulances. Managers asked crews to rest in shifts because tomorrow might bring long hours. In the background, the storm deepened over water with little resistance. Inside neighborhoods, Hurricane Katrina turned routine weekends into checklists that reached through every room. People emptied freezers, cooked what they could, and shared plates with neighbors. Windows took plywood if supplies were left, and tape went over glass when nothing else remained. Gas lines formed near dawn and stayed long into the afternoon across major roads. Some families chose to stay because wages were tied to shifts and because moving was costly. Others stayed because caregiving could not pause or because relatives refused to travel. Pets were a barrier for many who could not find places that allowed animals. For people who left, loading the car meant choosing what mattered and what could be left to chance. Photographs and papers went first, then clothing, medicine, and a box of simple tools. Neighbors swapped phone numbers again and promised to check on houses after the winds. Some locked doors and sat on porches to wait for evening rides. Across the region, the mood held steady and serious as lists grew shorter. During Sunday briefings, Hurricane Katrina framed every decision at city, state, and federal levels. The Guard moved troops and high-water vehicles toward likely impact areas and set rally points. The Coast Guard staged boats and helicopters where runways and docks had the best shelter. Urban search teams checked gear and entered names on call lists that would activate at first light. FEMA coordinated requests while clarifying that local and state agencies still held the lead. Mayors and parish presidents recorded messages for television and for phone systems that would run overnight. Utilities brought in mutual aid crews to stand by for power restoration as soon as winds allowed. Hospitals paired clinical chiefs with logistics leads so decisions could proceed without delay. Police departments shifted officers to higher ground and marked flood-prone underpasses on patrol maps. Public works teams filled sandbags for trouble spots and set barricades beside dips in the road. Rumors moved across radios and were corrected in real time to keep people focused on verified guidance. As dusk came, Hurricane Katrina felt present in the air, even where skies stayed clear and quiet. Churches held brief services and sent families out with snacks and printed phone lists. The Superdome took in thousands and set cots in long rows under bright lights. Elevators paused while generators were checked and while staff practiced moving patients between floors. Families who stayed at home filled bathtubs for washing and saved bottled water for drinking. Porch lights stayed on as long as power lasted, and then candles went into clean jars. Radio hosts took calls from listeners who wanted to share routes, lodging offers, and quiet fears. Police rolled slowly through blocks after curfew and asked people to bring trash cans inside. Trains stood idle in some yards because bridges would be inspected after the winds passed. Ferries tied fast and posted crews aboard to answer calls from the city. The last streetcar ran before midnight, and the route felt strange without it. Across kitchens and halls, people tried to sleep. Through the hours, Hurricane Katrina held its track and kept a powerful core over hot water. The latest model runs matched earlier guidance enough to confirm that the window for leaving had closed. Forecasters spoke about timing in careful minutes and described how fast conditions would worsen after sunrise. Pilots who flew research tracks reported strong winds near the center and shared numbers with quiet precision. Ships in the Gulf adjusted courses to give a wide berth and noted swell periods. Tug crews secured barges deeper in channels and watched lines strain as tides rose. In homes across the region, alarms were set, shoes were placed by beds, and flashlights were kept close. Hospitals brought non-critical patients into interior rooms and staged teams by stairwells. Shelters quieted as generators carried lights and air for the long wait. Police and firefighters tried to sleep in short rotations and saved strength for morning calls. Many who had hoped the track would bend now understood that hope had run out for this day. In the first light of Monday, Hurricane Katrina came ashore, and the day changed fast. Wind pressed against roofs and bent trees until they touched wet ground. Rain arrived in bands that wrapped the city and then passed, only to return again. Power flickered and then failed on block after block. Sirens sounded, and then fell quiet under the noise of gusts. Water crept up curbs near the lake. People moved to hallways and listened for news on battery radios. In hospitals, staff checked generators and taped doors. On piers and levees, spray turned the air to salt and grit. Along the Mississippi coast, Hurricane Katrina drove water across beaches and into neighborhoods that had boarded windows and cleared yards. Trees snapped along Highway 90 and signs twisted until bolts gave way. The surge moved past seawalls and filled streets with floating boards and coolers. In Biloxi and Gulfport, first floors vanished behind a fast gray tide. Crews who had stayed on duty shifted to safer rooms and marked stairwells with tape. Families climbed to second floors and pulled pets close. Radios reported that bridges shook and that barges strained at lines. The morning opened with noise and rising water. South of the city, water pushed across Plaquemines and up narrow roads between canals. Wind drove sheets of rain that made it hard to see the next bend. In towns near the river, crews watched gauges and called in readings through static. Barges thudded along moorings while tugs held them fast. Houses on piers shook as waves moved under them. At Buras, the first strike came with a groan in the walls. Pilings flexed and shutters ripped loose. People who had stayed pressed shoulder to frame and felt the building answer. The first hour carried power that left little slack. Across New Orleans, Hurricane Katrina pushed lake water against walls that guarded neighborhoods built at low elevations. Overtopping sent sheets into backyards and over streets near the shore. Pump operators watched levels and kept engines running as long as intake stayed clear. At some stations, power lines came down and backups took over with a cough and a shudder. Crews checked oil, belts, and valves by flashlight. In Gentilly and Lakeview, residents looked through blinds and saw waves slap at walls that had seemed distant. Boats tied in canals knocked and scraped. The day had begun to test the system. Inside the Superdome, people lay on cots while the roof trembled and lights flickered. Staff moved through aisles with water and simple food. Loudspeakers gave updates about timing and safety. Bathroom lines grew long as the morning stretched into noon. Parents told stories to keep children settled and played small games at the edge of blankets. Medical teams checked blood pressure and watched for heat stress when air grew thick. Security walked with measured steps and answered questions in calm voices. The building felt solid, yet alive to the wind. Each gust sounded like a long train rushing above everything. At major hospitals, Hurricane Katrina turned routines into careful triage under emergency light. Elevators stopped on floors that crews marked with signs. Ventilators ran on generator circuits that engineers guarded with careful checks. Pharmacy staff counted doses and set aside medication for the longest possible day. Nurses reassured families and kept notes by hand when networks failed. At charity and at private centers, teams moved patients away from windows and closer to core halls. Surgeons delayed elective cases and focused on urgent care that could not wait. Administrators kept lists of agencies that might send help when roads opened again. Police and fire crews worked through shrinking windows of safe response. Radios crackled and then went silent in pockets where repeaters failed. Dispatchers wrote calls on paper when computers blinked out. Units marked streets blocked by downed lines and by trees too large to move. In some districts, officers gathered people from ground floors and moved them higher. Firefighters closed bay doors and waited for winds to drop below limits. The sense of duty sat close to fear and to patience. Crews knew that minutes would feel long for callers. The job was to last until movement became possible again. Along the coast of Mississippi, Hurricane Katrina lifted heavy objects that seemed fixed to place. Casino barges strained against moorings and some slipped free. Walls failed when debris became rams in fast water. Concrete spans lost sections as pilings shook and bearings shifted. Neighborhoods that had watched past seasons from porches now watched from attic stairs. People called relatives only to hear nothing but quiet on the line. In shelters to the north, volunteers marked names on clipboards to track families. The line between land and gulf blurred and then moved inland. In that shift, the first losses became clear. Radio meteorologists spoke steadily through static about the center and the shape of the wind field. They gave simple advice about interior rooms and about waiting for the second half to pass. Callers asked when it would be safe to check on parents who lived alone. The answer was to wait until gusts eased and debris stopped flying. Reports arrived about water inside police stations and about flooded engines at firehouses. Some callers described limbs piercing roofs and rain falling from ceilings. Crews logged each note and put pins on maps. The scale of need grew as minutes turned hard. East of the Industrial Canal, Hurricane Katrina pushed water into St. Bernard and toward Chalmette with force that stunned residents who had stayed. Streets turned to channels lined with fences and floating trash bins. The smell of fuel mixed with brine and soil. People marked heights on door frames with pencils as levels rose. Some escaped with small boats that had been tied in yards. Others climbed into attic spaces and cut vents for air. The refinery complex loomed through rain like a ship at anchor. Radios said help would come after winds eased. Until then, neighbors shared tools and words. On the long bridge over the lake, officials closed lanes and held vehicles at the tolls. Waves slapped at pilings and threw spray across the deck. Crews checked joints and watched for signs of movement that would require a full stop. South of there, smaller bridges on local roads had already become unsafe. Drivers who had left late found turnarounds blocked by rising water. Some parked on higher ground and waited inside with windows cracked. The sense of time stretched and broke into short tasks. Breathe, drink water, call when a signal returns, rest eyes, wait for the next update. Across parishes and counties, Hurricane Katrina cut power as lines crossed and as poles snapped in sodden ground. Substations tripped and the grid went dark in wide patches. Utility crews waited in staging areas with bucket trucks lined like a small army. They could not move until winds dropped and roads cleared. Dispatch tracked critical sites such as hospitals, water plants, and shelters. Generators roared and burned fuel at a steady rate. Managers counted diesel and planned resupply as soon as a route opened. Families lit candles and moved carefully to avoid fire. Night would come early without street light glow. Between bans, some neighborhoods felt a brief softening that invited people to look outside. Gusts still snapped small branches and threw them down like dark birds. Neighbors shouted across driveways to check on needs. Doors opened and then closed as rain returned. A few blocks sat high enough to keep water at the curb. Others watched it climb stairs with steady patience. One elderly couple tied a rope between porches to help with balance. A nurse on her day off checked 5 houses for insulin and for an inhaler. The center had not yet passed. The longest hours still waited. In the marsh to the south, Hurricane Katrina tore at banks that had been shrinking for years. Chunks of sod broke loose and drifted with reeds and small crabs. Camps along narrow passes lost porches and then rails. Fishing sheds lifted and moved like boxes in a current. Navigation markers leaned until their lights touched the water. Oil field access roads vanished under waves. Wading birds rose, circled once, and vanished into rain. The shape of the coast changed a little in one morning. That change mattered because surge found new paths. Inland neighborhoods felt the result as hours wore on. Calls arrived from people in attics who had retreated as rooms below filled. Some had axes and used them on thin boards in gables. Others waited near vents and tried to keep air moving. Volunteers with small boats listened even before official requests came. A few launched as soon as winds eased below the point that made navigation impossible. They marked intersections in notebooks and planned short loops. The idea was to learn where water stood deepest and where voices sounded close. They would return when it was safe. Until then, the job was to keep calm and keep listening. By late morning, Hurricane Katrina made another landfall to the east and forced more water into bays that opened toward the Gulf. The fetch had built for hours, and the push was steady. Houses on the shore in Pass Christian and Bay St. Louis felt forces that frames could not answer. People who had stayed on high points watched waves cross roads that had never taken water. Debris moved like low walls across intersections and then drifted into trees. When the peak began to ease, silence returned in steps. It left wind, and then rain, and finally ringing quiet there. After the main winds eased, the first movements began under heavy skies. Coast Guard crews lifted and moved through air that still shook with turbulence. Pilots called out street names and landmarks to spot targets for hoists. Small boats from nearby parishes launched in pairs to share risk. Guardsmen checked staging plans and listened for clear requests. City leaders tried to gather reports through broken channels. Many calls were simple and heavy. An address, a count of people, a note about a child or an elder, maps filled with marks. The work would stretch past daylight and into the night. As afternoon turned to evening, Hurricane Katrina left behind broken lines, deep water, and a city waiting for news about its walls. Boats began to reach blocks that had been cut off all day. Families waved towels and held flashlights against the gray. Police and volunteers marked houses with quick notes to show who had left. In dark rooms, elders sat on chairs and saved strength. Nurses in shelters counted supplies and sent requests toward the state. Utility managers assessed damage with care. The question of what held and what failed grew sharper by the hour. Night settled and waited. In the hours after landfall, Hurricane Katrina revealed breaks along canals and walls, and the city began to fill. Lake water pressed through low spots and through seams that had looked solid the day before. Residents watched lines rise on doors and measured time in inches. Pump stations lost power or lost access as intake bays drowned. Teams stayed as long as they could and then pulled back for safety. Sirens faded under wind and then under water. Streets turned to channels. The bowl shape of neighborhoods became visible as water sought the lowest ground and stayed. Boats drifted loose. At the 17th Street Canal, concrete panels failed beside earthen banks, and a wide cut opened into Lakeview. The storm had driven water high against the floodwall, and the soil under the base gave way. A churning plume poured through the gap and rushed into streets that sat below the lake. Houses took water past porches and toward attic stairs. Some residents launched small skiffs that had been tied behind sheds. Others waved towels from windows and waited for help. The breach grew under pressure until daylight showed a jagged edge where a line had stood. Silence followed the roar. On the London Avenue Canal, two failures formed and poured water into Gentilly. The storm raised levels until slab houses floated off footings and cars drifted into fences. People moved upstairs and wrote names on damp walls to keep track of who had made it. Neighbors tied doors with rope and listened for voices beyond the rain. The water was not a wave. It was a steady arrival that would not stop. Pumps on that side had no path to send it away. Streets vanished and became a slow river with mailboxes marking the old grid. Yards sank below porches. At the Industrial Canal, a long breach hurled water into the lower 9th Ward and through the grid of small homes. Hurricane Katrina had driven surge from the east through cuts that led toward the canal. When the wall failed, a fast current carried houses off blocks and pushed them against others. Neighbors yelled across widening spaces and tried to reach one another with ropes. Boats appeared where streets had been at dawn. The scene mixed noise and sudden quiet as buildings shifted and then settled. The cut did not close. It drew the neighborhood into a new shape. Slowly. New Orleans sits in a set of bowls that drain toward pumps and then toward the lake and the river. The storm turned that design into a trap when walls failed and when power could not hold. Water that entered could not escape without engines and sluice gates. People saw the map of land by watching where boats floated and where tree crowns stood clear. Intersections became small ponds divided by stop signs. The tilt of streets showed which houses would take the deepest water. The plan had worked in rainstorms. It could not answer this level of force. Now, at pump stations across the city, operators worked until floodwater reached their steps and covered intakes. The storm cut power to some sites and made others unreachable. Engineers had planned for heavy rain, not for long periods with stations marooned by deep water. Crews tried to keep engines running with fuel on hand while watching for rising levels that would short controls. When the choice became leave or risk lives, they left and marked times on slips of paper. Those notes would guide the restart when routes opened. The silence that followed meant water had no exit. Streets kept filling. Across neighborhoods, people moved into attics as rooms below filled. The storm had removed fast paths onto roofs when rain soaked wood and when tools were scarce. Some found handheld saws and cut through thin boards near vents. Others pushed through weak spots and crawled into the light. Roof peaks became small islands marked by towels and by sheets. Calls for help moved across blocks as voices answered each other. Boats reached some streets and moved house to house at a careful pace. The rise was uneven and confused. It was slow, yet it never seemed to stop. Night pressed. To the east, surge had traveled along Lake Bourne and through the ship channel toward the funnel near the industrial canal. The storm turned that corridor into a force that few had imagined in daily planning. Water climbed levees from the outside and found weak joints along the inside edges. Communities in New Orleans East and St. Bernard saw levels rise past the reach of parked cars and porch rails. The sound of moving water filled the air. It carried debris and it carried fuel. When it settled, the line left on brick and siding stood shoulder high and higher. By midday on Monday, reports from across the city described a patchwork of blocks that had escaped and blocks that had gone under. Hurricane Katrina did not respect parish lines or neat shapes on maps. High ground along old natural levees stood dry. Low ground around drained swamps took on feet of water and then more. Communications failed in many places, and messages moved by runners or by handwritten notes taped to doors. Police marked routes that could carry small boats and kept traffic away from hidden holes. The city had become a maze shaped by depth and luck. Everywhere. Inside hospitals near the lowest ground, water crept through loading areas and rose toward first-floor corridors. Hurricane Katrina had left generators running, yet fuel access and exhaust paths were fragile. Staff formed bucket lines to move supplies upward and turned stairwells into lifelines. Patients were lifted with sheets and with careful hands. Windows that faced courtyards leaked around frames. Kitchens saved dry goods and water for the longest possible day. Ambulance bays turned into shallow pools. Helicopter pads became central targets once air was safe. Every floor planned for sleep in shifts, while alarms beeped in the dim light. Around the Superdome, streets had turned into shallow lakes that cut off easy movement. Hurricane Katrina had peeled sections of the roof and sent water through seams onto upper walkways. Inside, staff placed trash cans under leaks and moved people away from wet floors. Outside, the ramp system sat above a spreading sheet that reflected the gray sky. Buses could not run where water covered engines. Families who had arrived before the storm asked about routes and about relatives who had not reached shelter. Loudspeakers carried simple messages. Stay patient, stay together. Help would arrive when movement was possible. Soon. On the Mississippi coast, water began to fall after the peak while the wreckage settled into streets and lots. The storm had blown out windows and had stripped walls, yet the surge there had a crest and a fall. In New Orleans, the story went the other way as the bowl kept taking water. Families called across states to trade news and to offer beds. Roads into the city were blocked or broken. Bridges needed checks before heavy loads could pass. The urgent need was inside the flood. That contrast shaped priorities and the first large moves. Rescue planning concentrated. Questions about design began even as crews tried to reach people. Hurricane Katrina forced a hard look at walls that sat on soft soils near canals. Some panels were built in an older style with shallow sheets that did not bite deep enough. Overtopping at other lines scoured the back sides and removed the dirt that held them steady. Those details would take months to explain in full. On this day, the fact was plain. Breaks had opened and water had free paths. The task was to close gaps and to drain the bowl while lives were still at risk. Engineers and contractors began to scout breach edges by boat and by helicopter. The storm had left scrap and wreckage that made access slow and dangerous. Crews measured spans and looked for places where rock or sandbags might take hold. The first efforts were small because equipment could not reach. Dump trucks could not ford deep water. Cranes needed firm pads that did not exist yet. Helicopters would later drop heavy bags when weather allowed. On this day, the work was marking and planning. Closing the cuts would take time. Draining the city would take longer. Patience met fierce urgency. On porches that still stood above the waterline, people marked height with chalk and waited. The storm had turned the day into a patient contest between rise and reach. Those with boats moved first to the nearest calls. They ferried elders, children, and those who were ill. A few carried dogs in their arms with quiet care. Roof shingles cracked under long hours of sun and wait. Calls to relatives rolled to voicemail or to silence. The city grew quiet except for rotors and for the slap of paddles. By evening, the stillness felt heavy and final. Lights failed widely. The water carried more than rain. Hurricane Katrina had mixed fuel, soil, and sewage into a dark broth that stung eyes and skin. Cars leaked fluids and tipped against curbs. Freezers warmed and added smell to the still air. Small fires burned in places where lines sparked and where gas found a flame. Snakes and insects rode boards and drifted into yards. People wrapped feet in plastic bags to keep wounds from contact. Hospitals warned about infections and about the need to boil water when supply returned. The flood was a living thing that moved and changed by the hour. Rescue crews built a picture of the flood, one address at a time. Hurricane Katrina set the scope, and people on the ground translated it into lists and routes. Coast Guard helicopters circled and marked clusters for hoists. The Guard brought high water trucks into shallow edges, and then staged for deeper work. Police kept order where crowds formed on dry strips and overpasses. Volunteers ran skiffs in short loops so fuel would last. Crews learned which alleys had hidden currents and which yards hid ditches. The map became memory held in notebooks and in quick talks along the banks. Night drew across the flooded city as crews paused only to refuel and to rest eyes. The storm had broken walls and had turned familiar streets into long pools without edges. Water stood in schools and in stores and in living rooms that held family photographs. The sound of insects returned and mixed with generators and with distant rotors. Leaders met in rooms lit by flashlights and tried to join a plan from scattered pieces. The work ahead was clear. Close the cuts. Reach the stranded. Begin to drain the bowl. The city waited for that shift to begin. Silently, Hurricane Katrina set the frame for long hours inside hospitals, the Superdome, and the convention center as August turned to a gray week. Generators hum-filled stairwells while wind rattled loose panels above. Teams settled into rotations that felt both urgent and slow. Nurses taped names on gowns, so introductions would hold through sweat and noise. Doctors kept lists by hand and rationed power among lights, ventilators, and basic pumps. Orderlies pushed beds away from windows and moved patients toward interior halls. Families whispered near cots and tried to keep children calm. Security walked in measured loops and answered questions with steady voices. Outside, water set limits and made roads into mirrors. Inside, time lost markers and became tasks, checks, and whispered encouragement, all together. Within major hospitals, the day shifted into a careful routine that hid how fragile things were. Elevators stood still and stairwells carried stretchers, one landing at a time. Pharmacy teams counted doses by flashlight and sent nurses out with paper packets. Engineers guarded generator rooms and listened to engines as if they were patients too. Fuel moved by hand in small transfers that kept the machines alive. Windows leaked along frames and left towels heavy with brown water. Staff taped plastic where they could and saved dry corridors for sleep. Families waited in chapel spaces and whispered prayers for breath, strength, and patience. Every hallway felt warm. The air tasted of bleach, battery heat, and rain. Hope lived in tasks that could be done now. Hurricane Katrina turned the Superdome into a city-sized waiting room where rules had to be simple and kind. Wristbands marked entry, and cots stretched in straight rows under bright lights. Volunteers handed out water, diapers, and simple meals from pallets that shrank as hours passed. Medical teams set triage tables near interior walls and kept wheelchairs moving. Bathroom lines grew long and then longer when plumbing faltered. Heat gathered in the upper levels and drifted down. Staff asked people to rest, to avoid candles, and to report any medical need at once. Loudspeakers offered steady updates about safety and about patience. Each message was short to save power. The building held, yet the roof leaked in places that could not be reached by anyone. In the long night that followed, the Superdome became a place of small kindness and of hard waiting. Children colored on scraps of paper while parents watched the ceiling and listened for the next announcement. Elders rested on folding chairs when cots ran out. Custodial crews mopped leaks and pushed water toward drains that clogged again. Security kept tempers from rising when lines moved too slowly. Medics treated dehydration and checked blood sugar for people who had left medication at home. Volunteers greeted each new bus with calm words and a bottle of water. Everyone asked about timing. The answer was honest and limited. Movement would come when weather eased and when roads and buses could return. Until then, patience carried the room together gently. Hurricane Katrina also drew thousands toward the convention center after word spread that buses might arrive there. The building was large and easy to find, and wide sidewalks seemed safer than flooded streets. People came on foot from many blocks with children, relatives, and pets in carriers. Supplies were thin from the start. Water and food ran short as the crowd grew. Shade helped at first. Then the heat settled in and made patience harder. Trash piled where bins overflowed. There were few officials to answer questions for long stretches. Rumors came and went. When night fell, people pressed together for safety and for rest. The morning brought hope that buses would finally arrive. Mothers counted bottles. Elders searched shade. Neighbors shared careful sips together. In downtown wards, hospital teams faced problems that grew as hours passed. Air conditioning failed and rooms warmed until staff moved patients to cooler halls. Generators needed fuel that could not travel easily through flooded streets. Pharmacy fridges held on while ice was packed around vials and bags. Clinicians used paper charts and kept track of allergies and doses by careful repeat. Supply closets mattered more than technology. Sheets became slings. Hand pumps stood in where power faltered. The roof became a landing zone whenever weather allowed brief flights. Babies and the most fragile went first because every minute gained mattered. The work felt endless and exacting. The kindness inside that work kept fear manageable. Teams rotated, whispered plans, and saved strength through steady companionship. Hurricane Katrina pressed caregivers into moral choices that felt close and heavy. When floodwater reached loading bays, moving patients meant carrying them through heat and across uncertain footing. Some facilities kept people inside because the stairs were dark and slick. Others chose to move the sickest first, despite the risk. Families helped lift and guide. Aides sang to keep rhythm on difficult descents. Doctors weighed the safety of remaining against the danger of travel. Every plan was a compromise created by weather and by water. The idea was to keep people alive until airships or boats could reach the door. Small triumphs mattered. A safe transfer, a working battery, a moment of rest. Those minutes added up and made survival possible for many people nearby. By the second day, the convention center held a large crowd with few supplies and limited shade. Community leaders emerged from within the lines and began to organize by aisle and door. Elders were given chairs and children were kept near volunteers with water. People created signboards that listed missing relatives and meeting points. Trash was gathered into corners to clear paths. Songs rose and helped the hours pass. The need for restrooms remained a constant strain. Without regular deliveries, small resources were stretched across many hands. Police patrols passed but often could not stay. Rumors said buses were close. When the first coaches finally arrived, cheers rolled through the heat. People waved towels, lifted children, and counted seats with careful, grateful relief together. As buses reached the Superdome, evacuation began in careful stages that balanced need and order. Medical cases and elders boarded first with attendants and with small bags. Families followed with instructions to stay together and to keep pets inside carriers. National Guard units guided lines and kept space clear along ramps. Loudspeakers repeated the boarding order several times. It took patience to match the speed of ramp and bus. Each coach felt like a small victory for those left inside. People clapped as seats filled and as doors closed. The line still stretched for hours. Water and food continued to move through the rows until the last trips left. Staff kept count, checked wristbands, and watched for families that needed extra time together to board. Hurricane Katrina strained communication between city, state, and federal teams while evacuation unfolded. Radios failed in pockets and left messages to travel by runner and by paper note. Yet landing zones took shape on rooftops and parking decks as pilots called down wind and distance. Helicopters hovered and crews lowered baskets with steady hands. Ambulances waited where ground allowed and took patients toward triage points that sent them farther inland. Buses formed convoys under escort to keep routes clear. Some trips turned back when bridges needed inspection. Others reached shelters 2 or 3 hours away. The work was imperfect and human. It moved, paused, and then moved again. Each mile carried relief for riders and created space for the next evacuation wave down the road. In long hours that bled into one another, local volunteers stood beside formal teams and kept people steady. Church groups brought coolers and simple food as soon as access allowed. Neighbors with boats ferried medicine across shallow water to hospital doors. Teachers gathered children into small groups and led songs to keep spirits up. The convention center still held many who waited for transport. Buses came in burst and lull. Aid workers checked wrists and wrote names for family tracing. When tempers rose, elders asked for calm, and people listened. The center of each effort was simple: water, safety, and a promise of movement. That promise held people through the heat and through the constant ache of uncertainty and loss. It was real and needed. Hurricane Katrina sent patients outward in waves that traced highways toward inland cities. Some went to Baton Rouge on short flights or by ambulance under escort. Others reached Houston after long rides broken by rest stops and checks. Babies rode in warm arms that never let go. Elders leaned on shoulders and slept at last. Volunteers passed watered-down aisles and offered blankets. Nurses moved seat to seat and watched for dizziness or fear. When a bus arrived, shelters clapped for the riders and pointed toward food and cots. Paperwork followed later. People were greeted first as neighbors who had endured a hard day. Those welcomes mattered because they marked safety and reminded everyone that distance could still hold community through care and clear hands. Through the following nights, hospitals kept a heartbeat of care in buildings that had grown dark and hot. Teams slept in short turns on floors and under desks. Coffee came from camp stoves and tasted like resolve. The smallest bright things kept people steady. A working light over a chart table, a quiet word at 4 a.m, a hallway breeze when a door opened and cool air found a path. The city beyond was still and wide. The need felt larger than any plan, and yet the plan went on. Step by step, with names and tasks and the next safe move. Those hours taught a slow courage that rests in service and in ordinary promises, kept for patients and for each other. Hurricane Katrina left the shelters and hospitals marked by long effort and by a steady belief in care. The Superdome emptied in stages that required patience and clear voices. The convention center sent people onward to safer ground. Wards released patients after flights and convoys opened paths. The building stood, tired and leaking, yet still places of help. Outside, boats and helicopters carried the next phase into streets and yards. The flood waited, and people waited with it. Inside each departure, there was a quiet promise to return when the city could take people home. The day after felt lighter. The work of rescue and of order would stretch farther across the map. New routes opened, and voices called out addresses in clear sequence together. On the first full day of rescue, Hurricane Katrina set the rhythm as boats launched and rotors lifted into humid air. Water still covered long stretches of the city and the coast, and callers gave addresses with voices that shook but stayed clear. Pilots checked winds, crews readied baskets, and divers clipped lines to harnesses that had been checked again and again. Neighbors pulled skiffs off trailers and tied extra fuel to milk crates. Dispatchers drew maps on paper as radios faded in and out. By mid-morning, the pattern was simple to say and hard to live. Lift, search, land, and go again. For people on rooftops, the noise meant hope moving closer. Along the flood, Coast Guard crews made the first wide sweeps and called out coordinates as steady as breathing. Helicopters hovered over small squares of dry, sending down the cable and the sling, then lifting in bursts that strained ears and hearts. Swimmers rode the line to people who had waded through long nights, and they spoke in short promises that calmed shaking hands. Every hoist took time, and every minute in the wind counted. So pilots trimmed power and kept the machine exactly where it needed to be. From the air, the city looked like scattered islands and bright tiles set in dark water, and the routes between them were thin and changing. Crews marked clusters, circled back, and passed new targets to boats that could thread under wires and along narrow lanes. On the water, neighbors in small boats worked with a quiet focus that came from knowing the streets by smell and by sound. They turned down alleys that hid ditches and posted someone at the bow to watch for fence tops and sharp metal. People waved towels, shirts, and sheets, and voices carried across the flat water farther than on dry days. Many who launched had no badges and no orders, only the hard logic of wanting to reach the closest voice, and then the next one. They learned which stores had awnings that caught the wind, and which corners funneled a current that could turn a bow in a breath. They loaded elders first and carried children in life jackets that were too big, holding tiny chins above the water with gentle hands. High ground became gathering points that felt like small towns built in a day. Overpasses filled with people, dogs, coolers, and folded chairs, and volunteers set out boxes of water near the shade of a beam. Medics marked makeshift triage areas with tape and sorted needs into simple lanes that could be worked with the supplies at hand. Families wrote names and phone numbers on paper plates and on cardboard so reunions could happen after long rides. From these small hills, the view reached across the still water to rooftops where people waved and waited. Buses pulled up when routes opened, and applause rolled down the lanes as seats filled and engines turned toward inland shelters. Hurricane Katrina complicated every call for help because radios dropped, phones failed, and maps were out of date in blocks that now sat underwater. Dispatchers used paper logs and runners, while teams built a common picture on the fly through short briefings at boat ramps and helipads. People from different agencies learned one another by face and by first name, before learning by channel. Simple language helped when batteries ran low. The idea was always the same, even when the plan shifted by the hour. Find the people, move them, and come back with fuel and news. Mistakes were owned and corrected because there was no time to defend a choice that had not worked. Rescuers met the bond between people and pets in ways that changed who boarded first and where a boat could go. Rules were tested by faces and by tears, and many crews found space for carriers and for a leash wrapped around a wrist. At hoists, pilots weighed the safety of bringing up an animal against the need to move a child or an elder, and choices were made with care. On boats, dogs settled at feet, and cats stared from towels with wide eyes that told their own story about waiting and noise. People were calmer when those companions stayed close, and that calm made crowded decks safer for everyone. Hurricane Katrina placed special weight on moving people who used wheelchairs, walkers, or oxygen, and the work adjusted to meet those needs. Crews learned which porches allowed a ramp and which doors opened wide enough for a stretcher. Neighbors cleared paths and lifted with slow, even steps, taking breaks on stairs where air moved a little. Inside staging areas, medics offered simple checks, a cup of water, and a word that said, "You are safe and you are not alone." Transport teams wrote names and destinations on cards so family could track where a van or a helicopter had gone. Along the Mississippi coast, rescues moved through neighborhoods that had been scoured by surge and scattered with timbers, glass, and sand. Boats threaded between slabs where houses had stood, and crews checked attics that now sat at ground level. People stepped out with care because nails waited under the shallow water, and medics cleaned cuts before loading for the ride inland. Bridges were missing spans, so helicopters carried more of the load than in past storms, moving patients to schools that had become clinics. The water there fell through the day, but streets were broken, and every trip needed a new path around debris and deep holes. In the lower Ninth and in St. Bernard, the current still ran fast along some lines, so boats tied off to posts and advanced by short pulls. Crews listened for voices in the quiet that followed the wind, and paused often to pick a safe angle. They pushed ladders to windows and steadied them while people climbed down and into shallow water or into the waiting hull. Many asked to check a neighbor before leaving, and crews made room for that promise when time allowed. Each small choice kept trust intact and turned a hard moment into a manageable one. Search teams marked doors and frames with symbols that recorded date, hazard, and count, so later crews could read the story of a visit in a glance. These marks became a quiet language across blocks, a register of care and of careful work done under heat and pressure. People who returned would see them and know that someone had come, had looked, and had gone on to the next place. The system was simple enough to carry in a pocket and clear enough to stand after rain and sun. It spared time, saved duplication, and made a map where formal maps had failed. When night returned, the work did not stop, but it did slow to the pace that safety would allow. Boats ran with spotlights and with a second set of eyes at the bow, and helicopters flew only when weather, fuel, and light could be trusted. Rescuers slept in shifts on church floors and school stages and woke to coffee that tasted like a promise. Prayers were said in quiet corners, and phone batteries were rationed like medicine. Each dawn brought new addresses, and each address brought a face that would be remembered long after the water went down. From across the region and from far cities, more teams arrived with flatboats, airboats, high water trucks, and trained dogs. Hurricane Katrina had sent a call that moved along firehouse walls and into group texts and into long chains of friends who knew how to help. They checked in with local command and took assignments that matched what they could do, then went out with a partner they trusted. Supply points stacked water, socks, gloves, and fuel, and simple tools like tarps and rope were handed across tables. Paper signs wrote the rules plainly: drink, rest, check on someone, and return with what you learned. Risk lived in every move, and crews managed it by speaking aloud, by repeating steps, and by stopping when something felt wrong. Hurricane Katrina filled basements and covered open manholes, and the water hid stairs, ditches, and glass that could cut a hand or a foot. Teams wore life jackets, helmets, and gloves, even in heat that made clothing cling, because the job was to last the week, not the hour. When injury came, friends reached out and closed ranks, then shifted assignments to keep the day moving. That calm in the middle of strain kept rescues humane and kept hope within reach. Across many parishes, Hurricane Katrina kept reshaping the task as new breaches were confirmed, and as pumps failed and then returned. Boats that had worked one neighborhood shifted to another, and pilots moved landing zones to school roofs and to parking decks with clear approaches. Families who had left messages in chalk found answers when volunteers arrived with notes from a cousin or a friend across town. Small radios carried music for a moment, and people smiled at a tune that had scored an ordinary season a month before. Those brief sparks of normal life helped the long pull continue through the afternoon heat and into the softer light near evening. At airports that could open, guardsmen and ground crews formed lanes that brought stretchers and families to aircraft with loud, friendly ushers. Pilots took on fuel and weight as charts allowed, and they left with seats full and lists that would follow by fax or by voice. To the west, shelters in Texas and in small towns across Louisiana placed cots in rows and added play corners where volunteers read stories. They welcomed nurses and medics from the city and gave them coffee, showers, and a moment to sit with a phone and call home. Katrina had emptied many rooms and filled others, and people learned new maps of care that crossed parish and state lines without fuss. In the weeks that followed, people would remember how the sound of blades meant a life about to change. Neighbors would remember the steady hands that tied a knot and the quiet voice that said, "You are coming with us now." Hurricane Katrina made those hours the measure of what a community can do when water rises and roads fail. The day closed with aircraft heading west, boats tied at ramps, and crews planning a push toward new blocks and names. During the crucial days of response, Hurricane Katrina turned coordination into a test no plan could fully ease. City leaders gathered scarce reports and tried to speak with one voice through broken lines. The State Emergency Center worked with counties and parishes while building a picture that changed by the hour. Federal teams staged aircraft, trucks, and supplies at airfields and depots. Everyone needed clarity about who could ask, who could send, and where to land. Radios failed in pockets and phones fell silent for long stretches. The result was effort without common sight until patient work rebuilt it. Slowly. Inside the City Emergency Center, staff used the incident command system to keep roles clear even when information was thin. Sections for operations, planning, logistics, and finance met around folding tables with maps spread under light. Situation boards listed shelters, hospitals, and pump stations. Runners carried updates between rooms when radios cut out. Liaison from police, fire, and public works sat shoulder to shoulder and learned one another by name. Requests were typed when networks held and were handwritten when they did not. Every entry needed a destination, a priority, and a route. The system steadied minds during confusion then. At the State Emergency Center, leaders balanced wide duty with urgent detail. Hurricane Katrina had touched multiple regions at once, so requests came in stacks. The Emergency Management Assistance Compact opened paths for crews from other states. Offers arrived for boats, medics, communications gear, and search teams. Each offer needed a mission, a staging point, and a clear lead. The Guard coordinated with state police to escort convoys through choke points. Fuel, maintenance, and rest were planned with as much care as rescues. When phones were quiet, staff used radios and paper. Progress depended on discipline and patience everywhere then. Federal coordination moved through the National Response Framework that assigns roles by function. Hurricane Katrina triggered major disaster declarations that unlocked assistance and mission assignments. FEMA managed requests and linked them to agencies with the right skills. The Army Corps focused on water control and on making navigation possible. The Coast Guard led rescues on water and in the air. Health and Human Services supported medical teams and patient tracking. Transportation worked on air and ground routes for supplies and buses. Each mission required data that was hard to gather. That gap slowed actions until scouts and liaisons filled it. In the city, elected leaders faced cameras and a flood with few lines left to pull. Hurricane Katrina exposed the difference between formal authority and practical reach. Orders carried weight only if someone could hear them and act. Police and fire worked through their own structures while sharing resources where possible. The Guard answered to the governor and supported law and rescue. Federal teams offered help that required requests and staging space. Confusion grew when words did not match capacity on the ground. Clear roles returned as people met face to face and built trust around simple tasks done well. Logistics decided outcomes more than speeches. Hurricane Katrina broke normal delivery routes and forced creative chains that began at distant warehouses. Pallets moved to forward bases by air and by long convoys. From there, trucks needed fuel, escort, and directions to drop sites that were dry. Forklifts were scarce, so unloading became hands and teamwork. Water, tarps, baby formula, and simple medical kits were the core of first deliveries. Lists grew longer as evacuations scaled. Tracking was done on clipboards and on whiteboards that smudged in heat. The work looked simple and felt complex. It saved lives every hour here. Public communication mattered because people needed truth and plain guidance. Hurricane Katrina filled the void with rumor whenever updates lagged. Local radio kept steady tone and gave addresses for pickup points. Television pooled coverage and shared images that pressed leaders to explain decisions. Press briefings worked when speakers had facts and when they said what they did not know. Conflicting statements hurt trust and slowed movement. Translators and faith leaders helped reach those who had missed earlier orders. Flyers and loudspeakers turned parking lots into message boards. The goal was simple. Speak clearly, keep promises, return often with the next step for all. Public safety agencies balanced rescue with order. Hurricane Katrina stretched shifts past limits and left officers working without sleep in heat and water. Mutual aid brought deputies and troopers from other parishes and states. Command posts set sectors and schedules and paired locals with visitors who knew the streets. Curfews were declared to reduce risk and to keep routes open for medical and supply movement. Arrests were made for violence and for threats to crews. Most encounters ended with help, not cuffs. The mission was to protect life and support rescue. That focus guided judgment through a hard week together. Engineers from the Army Corps pushed toward the breaches as weather allowed. Hurricane Katrina had cut wide gaps that demanded heavy work near soft ground. Helicopters dropped sandbags the size of cars. Barges brought rock where creeks and channels allowed. Crews built pads for cranes and then drove sheet piles to bite deeper than before. Pumps were repaired and restarted in stages that matched falling levels. This effort required constant talk between field teams and the emergency center. It balanced speed, safety, and the need to avoid new damage. Progress came in steps that seemed small until they added up. Mass evacuation continued while the city drained. Hurricane Katrina had displaced families across many neighborhoods, so buses moved in convoys from multiple pickup points. The Guard placed medics on some coaches to watch for heat and for faintness. Drivers were briefed on routes, rest stops, and end locations. Passenger lists were kept simple and accurate to support reunions later. At airports, flights carried patients and elders. Trains moved a smaller number where track and bridges held. Every lane out needed fuel and escorts. Each mile created room for the next load. The flow looked slow and was in fact steady. Situational awareness improved when scouts were paired with analysts who turned notes into maps. Hurricane Katrina had erased landmarks in some quarters, so handwritten sketches became the way to navigate. Volunteers brought GPS tracks that allowed teams to check depth and debris. A daily rhythm emerged around morning briefs, field updates at noon, and evening plans. Charts showed closed bridges, working pads, fuel points, and simple risk flags. Leaders learned to speak with care about numbers because counts shifted as buses rolled. Honesty about uncertainty protected trust. That trust let crews take hard assignments with confidence that backup would arrive. The public watched leaders at City Hall, at the state capitol, and in Washington. The storm placed each on a stage built by need and by television. The timing of orders was questioned while water still stood in homes. Declarations made sense to some and felt slow to others. Apologies were offered and accepted, and some were not. The work on the ground could not pause for debate, yet debate shaped the support that arrived. Over time, shared purpose reasserted itself. The lesson was familiar and hard. Clear authority matters, but cooperation and humility decide whether people get help fast. Non-profit groups filled many gaps while formal structures found their feet. The storm drew churches, civic clubs, and seasoned responders who knew how to set up kitchens. They cooked by the thousands and delivered to shelters where refrigerators were still warm. Volunteer doctors and nurses opened small clinics in schools and in tents. Warehouse spaces turned into donation hubs that sorted goods by type and by need. Coordination with official centers improved day by day through shared briefings. The effect was simple. More hands meant more care. The mosaic of local help made the response feel human and near everywhere. Finance and administration worked quietly to keep the mission funded and fair. The storm created costs that would be repaid later through complex programs. Staff kept receipts, tracked hours, and recorded missions with care even when tired. Contracts were reviewed for emergency clauses that allowed speed without waste. Small towns needed help to write requests and to claim reimbursement correctly. Donations were logged to match them with need. Good records served two aims. They protected public money, and they honored the work by telling its story in numbers and notes. That discipline supported trust long after the water was gone. As days moved forward, the focus widened from rescue to stability. The storm had scattered families across states, so housing and schools became the next shared task. Shelters transitioned to longer-term options with case managers and simple services. School systems paired with host districts to enroll students quickly. Hospitals worked with networks to place staff and to continue care for chronic needs. Small businesses sought help to reach suppliers and employees. Debris removal began with passes that opened streets and then collected by zone. These acts required the same calm coordination. They turned survival into the start of recovery. Lessons formed while the work continued. Hurricane Katrina taught that plans must assume wide loss of power and of communications. It showed that transportation for people without cars is not a detail but a core function. It reinforced the value of local knowledge paired with outside help. It proved that simple messages, repeated often, carry across fear and heat. It revealed how important logistics is to every promise made in public. It highlighted how hard it is to lead without shared sight. These lessons shaped reforms and training that would follow in quieter months across the country for future seasons. By the end of the first week, coordination settled into a steadier beat that linked city blocks to distant shelters and to deep repair along the canals. Hurricane Katrina was still present in every plan, yet the shape of effort had shifted from scramble to organized reach. City, state, and federal teams worked under one roof more often and spoke in brief, plain words. Supplies arrived on schedule, and evacuations followed a predictable pace. People began to look beyond today and to ask hard questions. Those questions would grow louder as water fell. The stage for explanation and argument formed. Hurricane Katrina forced a hard accounting that began while water still stood in streets. People wanted to know what failed, who decided, and why help felt late. Engineers walked breach edges while neighbors described sounds and sudden rushes. Reporters asked about warnings, buses, and the plan for those without cars. Leaders moved between cameras and conference rooms with limited information and pressure. In that heat, explanations formed quickly and solidified before the picture was known. Early focus settled on the flood protection system itself. Investigators found sections where concrete eye walls sat on soft soils and where sheet piles did not reach depth. Overtopping scoured inner sides and weakened supports that seemed sound. The system was designed for a standard storm, not a large and long event with wide surge. Maintenance had limits shaped by budgets and by jurisdiction. When pieces met a force, the chain failed at weak points. Attention also turned to the path water took toward the city. The navigation outlet from the river to the Gulf cut a fast route for surge through thinning marsh. Wetlands that slowed water were lost to canals, salt intrusion, and subsidence. Barrier islands eroded for decades. Soil under neighborhoods settled as drained ground dried. Each change was gradual. Together they made more open water and fewer breaks. Maps looked the same. Reality had shifted quickly. When debates sharpened, engineers explained that the system was a patchwork built to dates and standards. Some walls were designed against water levels that turned out to be too low for the storm that arrived. Probability curves were read with optimism that fit past records but not exposure. Models were coarse in places where details mattered. These were not errors. They were choices made within money and time. Disaster revealed margin that had become thin. Public argument soon widened beyond concrete and clay. People asked why evacuation plans had not moved residents without cars. They asked why buses stood idle, and why staging points were unclear to those who needed them most. City and parish plans assumed vehicles for households. Schedules for transport were thin and brittle. Pet rules kept families apart from shelters. Decisions reflected years of habit and funds. Result was a pattern that followed income and race. Another argument focused on speed. Families saw images of rooftops and asked why help was not everywhere at once. Officials answered that requests must match missions and routes, and paths were broken. FEMA managed forms that felt slow when eyes were on rescues. Guard waited for orders, balancing security and relief. Local leaders wanted flexibility while federal teams needed structure. Both were true. The gap was time and trust. Television turned that gap into anger. Stories about crime and chaos at shelters raced ahead of verification. Rumors of violence shaped decisions about staffing and routes. Later reviews found fewer incidents than early reports had claimed. Conditions were hard and fear was real. Yet the picture was one of patience and mutual aid. Words like lawless carried a weight that followed evacuees into cities. It took time to correct the record. Plans were built around threats that were smaller than feared. Debate over race and poverty came forward as images showed who had been left on overpasses and in lines. People saw how history shaped neighborhoods, schools, and options. They heard that wages and rent left little room to leave for days. They noticed which blocks sat dry and which were deep. The argument was not new. Hurricane Katrina made it visible at one time and scale. It forced leaders to speak about equity and preparedness. Hard questions rose around nursing homes and hospitals where evacuations failed or came too late. Some facilities sheltered in place without staff, fuel, or equipment. Families asked why contracts for transport did not hold. Prosecutors reviewed records and interviewed owners, directors, and staff. Many caregivers acted with courage and care under limits. Some decisions were negligent. The line between them was argued in court and in public. The lesson was capacity matters before the storm. Leadership faced scrutiny that mixed critique with the strain of the moment. People judged the timing of city orders, state requests, and federal actions. They argued about when to call for guard support and who should have insisted on unified command sooner. They counted buses that were not used and warnings that were not heard. Some leaders apologized and learned in motion. Others defended steps. The record showed delays and effort. Grief sharpened every assessment. Misunderstandings about authority shaped the story. Many believed martial law had been declared, which was not the case. The state used emergency powers, and guard operated under civil authority. That distinction mattered for searches, curfews, and the use of force. Some property owners felt unprotected. Others felt policed. Conflicts arose when access was restricted to areas that still held water or hazards. Clarity grew as rules were printed and posted. Confusion faded. Trust took longer. One bright thread ran through grim days. Coast Guard crews were praised for decisive action that did not wait for perfect maps or fixed radios. They trained for rescue and acted within clear authority. Their success became a reference for other parts of government. It showed what can happen when roles are simple and chains are short. That lesson did not erase duties. It offered a model that later reforms tried to apply where possible. The storm reopened debates about federalism and about shape of incident command for events that cross lines. Cities hold knowledge and must act first. States control the guard and coordinate across counties and parishes. Federal level brings scale, specialized teams, and money. Hurricane Katrina showed how hard it is to join those strengths when communications fail. Later guidance urged clearer triggers and prearranged agreements. Drills grew longer. The aim was faster cooperation under stress. Media coverage helped and hurt. It brought attention, donations, and volunteers. It also amplified early errors and framed the city through a lens of breakdown. Reporters worked in heat without power and made calls that would later be revised. Editors corrected stories, but first versions stayed in memory. Survivors felt seen and misseen at once. Hurricane Katrina taught newsrooms to build partnerships, slow, unverified claims, and center voices closest to the water and the work. Insurance became a field of dispute. Homeowners learned that wind and water were covered by different policies and proof divided claims. Adjusters walked slabs and soaked rooms and tried to separate causes in places where records had floated away. The flood program faced bills on a scale not seen before. Private carriers fought and settled and withdrew. People felt abandoned by contracts they thought they understood. Hurricane Katrina turned policy fine print into struggle daily. Environmental damage added questions that were not solved in a week. Floodwater held sewage, fuel, and silt. Spills stained yards and marsh. Debris contained chemicals from garages. Testing guided cleanup, but patience wore thin as smells lingered. People asked how long soil would hold risk and which neighborhoods needed deeper work. Agencies published maps and asked for time. Hurricane Katrina made clear recovery is more than walls and wires. It is ground and breath, too. Inquiries began while pumps ran. Local panels took testimony from engineers, managers, and residents. Federal reviews gathered documents and modeled the surge and the failures. The Corps accepted responsibility for design flaws in walls and committed to rebuild with stronger types and deeper foundations. Reports recommended higher standards and a system view that treated the region as one project. Hurricane Katrina became not a storm, but a case study that changed practice across the country. Emergency management adopted reforms that spoke directly to the gaps. New standards required redundant communications, satellite sets, and training that assumed weeks without power. Prearranged mission assignments shortened paperwork during days. Evacuation contracts grew clearer and included clauses for drivers and fuel. Shelters added plans. Cities built registries for people who would need help leaving. Drills tested buses and pickup points. Hurricane Katrina did not end confusion, yet it narrowed it and gave tools. Conversation moved from blame to responsibility shared across time. Designers, contractors, boards, and voters shaped the lines that stood or fell. Officials, responders, and neighbors shaped the hours that followed. The city's future would depend on choices made in calmer years. Hurricane Katrina forced a choice about investment, standards, and trust. The arguments did not vanish. They matured into budgets, audits, and habits. People kept asking who is accountable. The answer grew longer and precise. Scientists talked with planners about sea rise, subsidence, and rain. They spoke about heat in the Gulf and the reach of surge into bays and lakes. They asked for models that matched street grids, and for decisions that included evacuation for people without cars. Hurricane Katrina gave those talks urgency and seat at budget tables. The point was not prediction alone. It was capacity and humility. Plans would need to accept uncertainty and protect life. In homes across the country, families argued about blame while packing boxes to send. Some felt local leaders had missed clear signs. Some felt federal agencies had waited behind rules that could bend. Others saw a shared failure and a shared duty to rebuild. Katrina became shorthand in talk for the storm and institutions around it. That shorthand carried pain and a call to do better. The word marked a promise rather than a verdict. By the time water began to fall, outlines of failure and responsibility were clearer. The city had learned what broke and why choices felt narrow when hours mattered. Governments had learned where lines of duty crossed and how to cut them clean. Neighbors had learned they could be strong together. Hurricane Katrina left people scattered across states with questions open. The next work was return and repair. That work would take patience and reshape life. Hurricane Katrina scattered families along highways and into distant cities, and the first days after landfall felt like a blur of bus seats and folding chairs. People reached Baton Rouge, Houston, Dallas, Atlanta, Birmingham, and small towns that had never imagined hosting thousands at once. Gyms became dormitories and churches became kitchens, and the first question in every line was about loved ones. Phones charged on power strips and names were written on paper plates. Hosts opened spare rooms and swept garages, and strangers became neighbors by the second night. Local schools sorted donated uniforms, while libraries offered computers for email and job forms. Hotels waived deposits, landlords debated rent, and city councils voted on short-term rules that could hold a sudden population. Hurricane Katrina wrote new maps in hours, and the old routines fell silent like closed radios. People learned routes, clinic addresses, and where relief trucks parked. Evacuation centers turned into intake hubs where caseworkers recorded names, birthdays, and the last known address. Whiteboards listed missing relatives and phone numbers, and volunteers called shelters one by one. Some reunions happened within a day when buses crossed paths at airports, while others took weeks of slow messages. The storm scattered family documents, so identity was rebuilt with church letters, school IDs, and the trust of clerks. People lined and answered the same questions. Schools in host cities registered students by the hundreds and learned birthplaces they had never seen on forms. Principals found extra classrooms, and teachers gathered supplies from closets and from neighbors. Children wore new colors, learned new mascots, and tried to fit in while carrying a storm inside their heads. Hurricane Katrina made lunchrooms into orientation halls where maps, counselors, and quiet corners were as important as food. Tutors listened and helped with missing records. Adults searched for work in places that did not know their resumes, and employers tried to match skills quickly. Construction firms hired laborers, hospitals hired nurses and aides, and restaurants picked up cooks and dishwashers. Some jobs were temporary, some became the first step toward a new city, and some ended when return became possible. Hurricane Katrina turned the word relocation into a daily choice that reached into paychecks and into hope for many families. Applications for help moved through case numbers and interviews, and families learned the language of assistance. FEMA checks arrived for hotels, then for apartments, and later for small repairs that could not wait. Travel trailers were placed in driveways and on pads at large sites, and the metal smelled of new paint and heat. Hurricane Katrina made temporary feel permanent for a while, and then the clock turned again. Paperwork lingered even as roofs rose. Clinics in host towns saw long lines for refills, vaccinations, and simple checks that had been delayed. Counselors met parents who could not sleep and children who startled at sirens, and they used quiet rooms and slow talk. Church groups formed circles where people told stories about roofs, pets, cousins, and that first bus ride out. Hurricane Katrina left marks that were not visible, and care needed time as much as medicine for many months. Culture traveled with the people, and nights in Houston and Austin filled with brass, zydeco, and songs from memory. Chefs opened pop-ups and shared spices that tasted like home, and diners learned to order by names tied to parishes. Second lines appeared in parking lots beside box stores, and the beat pulled strangers into a circle. The storm carried sorrow, yet it carried music that kept people connected to place and to each other. Back home, neighborhoods sat quiet under brown lines left by floodwater, and the work of return began with a key ring. Families drove in on permitted days, opened doors, and faced rooms packed with silt and smell. Hurricane Katrina made mold a new language, and people learned masks, gloves, bleach, and the slow discipline of gutting. Photos were rinsed in tubs, letters were spread to dry, and small miracles appeared in the bottom of drawers. Choices about return were made at kitchen tables in borrowed apartments, and they were rarely simple. Some families decided to relocate because schools opened faster elsewhere and work had started, and leases felt like anchors. Others felt pulled back by elders, churches, and graves, and they vowed to gut, to fix, and to wait. The storm turned belonging into action, and every action cost time and money that were both scarce for thousands of households. Permits had to be pulled, inspectors had to sign, and contractors had to be found. Insurance adjusters walked rooms with clipboards, measured walls, and spoke carefully about wind and water. Grants moved through programs that asked for proofs many people no longer held, and reports took months to resolve. The storm exposed how fragile records can be, and agencies rebuilt files with photos, affidavits, and patient help. Checks arrived, then crews finally swung hammers inside. Block by block, neighbors returned to sweep sidewalks and to hang tarps, and signs went up for food and tools. Hardware stores reopened in half-lit aisles, and barbers cut hair under box fans near open doors. A diner might serve po' boys on paper plates while the ceiling waited for a patch, and it would feel like hope. Hurricane Katrina did not stop welcome, and the first open sign on a dark block mattered. The rental market tightened, and rents rose as damaged units stayed offline, and workers arrived for rebuild jobs. Public housing complexes faced closures, demolitions, and redesigns, and residents argued for speed, voice, and a right to return. Nonprofits helped renters find vouchers and understand lists, and landlords struggled with repairs, codes, and insurance that arrived late. The storm made housing a daily headline because home is the ground for every other choice in the city. Months stretched into a year, and many families built new routines in places they had entered only to rest. Children found teams and bands, parents joined churches and unions, and apartments filled with borrowed furniture became homes. Some visited on weekends to work on houses, then drove back for school on Sunday night, tired and hopeful. The storm stretched family geography across state lines, and the map held for a long time for many households. Church vans made regular trips back to neighborhoods for cleanouts, services, and simple checks on elders. Pastors stood in gutted sanctuaries and preached under rafters, while deacons handed out masks and boxed lunches. Choirs gathered in borrowed halls and sang familiar hymns, and the echo sounded like a promise to return. The storm could not silence that work, and the rhythm of Sundays helped people hold steady through long weeks of dust and heavy air. Utility crews raised poles, restrung wire, and checked transformers, and their trucks became a familiar sight on every block. Garbage contractors hauled debris to staging grounds, separated appliances from tree limbs, and returned for second and third passes. Water systems flushed and tested lines, while boil notices stayed up until lab sheets said clear. Hurricane Katrina made every basic service feel like a victory, and flags appeared on porches again as doors opened slowly everywhere. As people returned, patrols resumed, and officers learned new routes around closed bridges and fenced lots. Curfews lifted by neighborhood as lights came back, and store owners set chairs outside to watch the evening. Neighbors exchanged numbers again, formed watch groups, and kept an eye on empty houses that still waited. The storm had opened doors to strangers, and caution lived beside welcome for a time. Trust returned with steady days outside and shared meals. Streetcars rang again on short lines, buses restarted limited routes, and drivers waved from the wheel at familiar corners. Principals unlocked buildings, registered returning students, and hired staff who had also just come home. Classrooms ran on fans and open windows at first, and attendance grew as families crossed decisions off lists. The storm had scattered learning, and reopening a school showed a neighborhood that it could hold together again, one careful week at a time. Funerals were held across several states as families reconciled distance with grief and tried to honor custom. Cemeteries in the city received visitors who arrived with rakes, flowers, and quiet words, and caretakers guided them gently. The storm changed the shape of mourning, and remembrance had to travel before it could rest. Communities built new rituals around dates, places, and songs that could fit any room. They kept those rituals close through each hard anniversary. Return did not happen evenly, and some blocks lit up while others stayed quiet for seasons. Shops reopened where traffic allowed. Then clusters formed around clinics, schools, and corner stores that could take cards. Neighbors watched windows and waited for a friend to park one day and step out with a smile that said back. The storm left gaps that would take years to fill, and patience became a civic habit learned in long lines. Sports and parades returned in steps, and those gatherings offered a public way to say we are still here. A reopened stadium meant more than a game, and a small parade route meant more than a walk. The storm had paused the calendar, and simple dates regained power when people gathered safely. A band playing on a corner could sound like a door opening on the future. Neighbors paused and listened together in the sun. By the second year, many families had made a choice that felt firm enough to live with, whether in new cities or back home. They carried leases, school records, and tool lists, and kept keys on rings for houses still healing. Hurricane Katrina had scattered people and taught them to return in pieces, with patience, grit, and help. What came next was rebuilding walls, systems, and daily life, so that home could hold them again. In the months and years after Hurricane Katrina, rebuilding began with plans spread on tables and with boots in mud along the canals. Crews cleared streets, mapped damage, and set priorities that joined safety to speed. Families sorted insurance papers while engineers measured soil and checked every joint that had faced the surge. City offices reopened in borrowed rooms and learned to work with new systems while power returned in patches. The first goal was simple enough to say, close the breaches, drain the bowls, and keep water on the right side of the line. The second goal touched daily life. Dry homes, open schools, and clinics with lights on. The third goal looked farther. Stronger walls, wiser codes, and a city that could face another hard season without losing its breath. The Corps moved fast on a system-wide repair that would not repeat old mistakes. Designs replaced eye walls with stronger T-walls and drove sheet piles deeper into the soft ground. New gates rose at the mouths of the outfall canals, so lake surge would meet shut steel instead of long, narrow funnels. Crews built the surge barrier east of the city to block the funnel where tide and channel had pushed water toward neighborhoods. At Seabrook, a second structure guarded the lake entrance to the canal. After Hurricane Katrina, every joint, hinge, and pad was designed with more room for stress and for wear. The work was loud and plain. Welders sparked, pile drivers rang, and barges moved rock in steady lines toward the open cuts. At the canal mouths, massive pump stations were added so rain could still leave the city when the gates were shut. Engines sat high above flood level, and each unit had backups for power, lube, and control. Intake screens were built to shed debris and to protect the machinery from the small drift of daily life. Interior stations were repaired and raised where possible, with controls moved to drier floors and with new generators set on platforms. After long weeks of testing, operators drilled on starts, stops, and the sequence that protects motors under strain. Hurricane Katrina had taught that a wall without a pump turns a bowl into a trap. The design now joined barriers and drainage into one breathing system for storms. In neighborhoods, the work turned from gutting to building. Base flood elevations were raised, and many owners lifted houses on new pilings so floors would sit above the maps of risk. Crews set string lines and jacked frames while families watched from the curb with a mix of hope and worry. Grants and insurance checks arrived in steps, and the Road Home program became both lifeline and headache at kitchen tables. Contractors learned to dry in fast and to stage materials so mold would not return. Inspectors signed off on straps, bolts, and sheathing that tied roofs and walls into stronger frames. Hurricane Katrina had punished weak links wherever it found them. Carpenters, masons, and electricians built with that memory close to hand on every block. Building codes changed along with habits. Permits required wind clips, impact-rated openings in some zones, and inspection of tie-downs that connect structure to ground. Plumbers and roofers coordinated so penetrations were sealed with care and with products suited to standing water. Homeowners learned the value of shut-off valves and of keeping documents in waterproof boxes. Some chose insulation and higher efficiency to cut bills and to make houses bearable during long outages. Others added small solar hot water sets to give a measure of comfort when lines were down. The aim was simple: fewer points of failure and more ways to cope. Katrina had made every weakness visible. The rebuilders' answer was to make small strengths add up across streets until the pattern held. Schools were rebuilt as anchors for neighborhoods and as places where children could find steady days. Facilities reopened in phases with temporary rooms that became new buildings over time. The city adopted a broad charter system that drew teachers from near and far, and that rearranged bus routes for families across wide distances. Cafeterias served comfort food, and counselors set quiet corners where students could rest when noise became too much. Principals hired nurses and social workers in greater numbers, so care would not stop at the classroom door. Sports and bands returned and practiced in lots and in gyms with patched roofs. After Hurricane Katrina, a school was more than a schedule. It was a sign that a block would fill again with ordinary footsteps each morning. Healthcare rebuilt with a mix of large campuses and small clinics. A new medical center opened with modern labs and trauma rooms, and a new veterans hospital rose beside it to serve those who had worn the uniform. Neighborhood clinics expanded hours so people could get care without long travel. Mobile units brought vaccines and diabetes checks to church lots and school fields. Training programs grew to replace nurses and techs who had moved away. Records went digital to guard against another loss of paper. After Hurricane Katrina, mental health services were given new attention, with walk-in counseling and outreach that met people where they already gathered. The idea was simple and close to the heart. Care should not be another long line or a far drive. Utilities rebuilt for redundancy. Power companies set poles deeper and used stronger crossarms so lines would swing and not snap at the first hard gust. Substations were raised on platforms and ringed with walls that keep shallow floods at bay. Water plants added backup pumps and generators, and operators rehearsed manual controls to keep pressure stable when computers fail. Sewer lines were relined and lift stations were lifted. Transit bought buses with higher intakes and kept spares outside the floodplain. Road crews replaced deck sections and guardrails and learned which approaches need higher fill. The port reopened in phases and returned cargo to a schedule that reached far beyond the river bends. These were not glamorous jobs. They were the bones that carry a city through an ordinary week. Work also turned outward to the coast that had thinned. The shipping channel that had given Surge a straight path toward town was closed with a rock dam and with gates where traffic still needed to pass. Projects planted grasses and rebuilt marsh edges with dredged sediment, so waves would break before they reached hard walls. Barrier islands were restored where sand could hold and where birds would return. River diversions were studied and built to send fresh water and silt into basins that had sunk through years of loss. After Hurricane Katrina, many people understood that levees and pumps are not enough. The landscape itself must help carry the load by slowing water and holding soil. That work moves slower than concrete, yet it shapes the risk every season. Money for all of this moved through a maze of grants, bonds, insurance, and private savings. City Hall learned new rules for complex programs and hired staff who could read the fine print. Small businesses took loans, reopened in partial space, and served crews before tourists returned. Musicians raised funds to restore clubs and to replace instruments. Non-profits bought tools and set up training for trades, so young people could join the rebuild and find a path to steady work. After Hurricane Katrina, neighborhoods leaned on main streets to bring back daily life. A pharmacy, a grocery, a place to eat, and a place to hear a band were not extras. They were signals that a city was alive and ready to welcome its people home. Government changed how it plans for risk. Hazard mitigation lists grew from binders into live tools that drove budgets and work orders. Sirens were kept, but phones, texts, and neighborhood canvas teams became as important as any loudspeaker. Parishes built registries for people who would need help to leave, and bus contracts were written with fuel and drivers secured ahead of any forecast. Shelters were mapped with pets in mind so families would not have to choose between safety and a companion. Drills brought buses to pickup points and timed how long it took to load. After Hurricane Katrina, evacuation was treated as a system that must start clean, carry everyone, and end with a light on and a cot ready for a tired child. Archives, museums, and churches dried records and saved memory with gloved hands and patient work. Volunteers photographed pages before they crumbled and logged artifacts that had floated from rooms now stripped to studs. Conservators taught simple steps for families to rescue photographs and quilts. Historic districts debated how to repair without losing character, and carpenters learned to blend old wood with new braces that will hold under stress. Music halls replaced floors and tuned rooms again so horns and voices could rise. After Hurricane Katrina, people understood that cultural work is also critical work. It returns more than a stage or a display. It returns the sense that a city knows itself and can hand its story to the next generation with care. In time, the sound of hammers softened and gave way to the noise of a living place. After Hurricane Katrina, a stronger ring stood at the water. Streets held fewer puddles after rain, and porches filled at dusk. Work did not erase risk. It made room for routine to return with caution and better tools. People learned to keep bags ready and know neighbors. With that, daily life began to take its new shape. In the years after Hurricane Katrina, health, culture, and daily routines settled into new shapes that people learned step by step. Clinics reopened in borrowed rooms, then in permanent spaces with fresh paint and quiet waiting areas. Parents kept medicine lists in zip bags. Grandparents carried copies of prescriptions in wallets. People watched forecasts with a steadier eye and kept small radios near batteries. Kitchens stored bottled water next to rice and beans. Neighbors shared checklists for go bags. The city moved forward at a human pace, careful and practical, with lessons built from days that changed what normal meant. Respiratory care took center stage because mold had touched so many walls. Doctors saw more asthma flares and more coughs that lingered through humid months. Families ran dehumidifiers and opened windows when weather allowed. Free clinics offered masks and simple guidance about cleaning safely. Pharmacists volunteered at church fairs to refill inhalers and blood pressure pills. Researchers partnered with neighborhoods to track symptoms and share results in plain language. After evacuations, continuity mattered as records moved into digital files. People learned to keep copies on drives and in envelopes. Healthcare became closer to life than it had been before. Mental health entered conversations in kitchens, schools, and job sites. Counselors taught grounding techniques that could be used on buses or in lines. Employers invited social workers to staff meetings and asked managers to spot signs of strain. Parents watched for nightmares and for grades that slipped after moves. Elders talked about sudden tears and quiet days that felt heavy. Support groups met in libraries and shared numbers for hotlines that stayed open overnight. Insurance plans added visits for therapy and for case management. Churches paired prayer with referrals. Care felt less hidden, and seeking help became part of wisdom. People with diabetes rebuilt routines around new pharmacies and changed menus. Walking groups formed in parks as soon as paths cleared. Nurses led blood pressure checks after Sunday services and showed how to use home cuffs. Grocery co-ops opened in neighborhoods that had lost stores, and produce boxes became weekly habits. Cooking classes taught simple meals that handled tight budgets and limited equipment. Community gardens filled empty lots and gave shade as well as herbs. Clinics scheduled appointments later in the evening for workers with long commutes. Small steps mattered because they held together when stress returned for many. After the mud dried, questions turned to air, soil, and heat. Public health teams sampled yards and posted maps that showed where to avoid digging until cleanup finished. Parents learned to wash hands after play and to take shoes off at the door. City crews replaced topsoil at playgrounds and planted trees for shade. Summers felt hotter, and neighbors checked on elders during long afternoons. Cooling centers opened with chairs, water, and fans. The calendar of storms and heat shaped how people planned a week. Preparation felt like a routine rather than a special task. It became part of habit. Cultural life returned with careful steps that grew into steady gatherings. Clubs reopened with smaller stages and strong floors. Bands came back together after long months of scattered work. Chefs rebuilt menus and opened doors with limited hours and short staffs. Festivals resumed on shorter routes, then expanded as volunteers returned. Second lines filled streets again, and neighbors waved from stoops with relief. Art markets sprouted on weekends and carried prints of neighborhoods in repair. Stories moved between songs, and every set honored someone who had helped. The city kept its voice by using it and sharing rooms with grace. Sports offered a measure of confidence that daily life could return. Youth leagues drew sign-ups as fields reopened, and coaches emphasized patience as conditioning built again. High school bands practiced after class and learned new steps for halftime. College teams hosted games that brought alumni back for weekends of reunion and repair. Professional schedules resumed in buildings that had been patched and tested. Each scoreboard meant more than a number. It signaled logistics, safety checks, and lights that stayed on. Families lingered after games to talk with friends and to plan the next week with steadier voices for many families. Food carried memory between cities. In Houston, cooks opened shops that served dishes learned at home, and new customers became regulars. In Atlanta and Dallas, pop-ups brought boudin and gumbo to parking lots near apartments that held evacuees. Recipes were written down for neighbors who wanted to try a pot on Saturday. Back in the city, corner stores returned with hot plates and coffee at dawn. Farmers' markets connected rural parishes to town again. A plate could say welcome without a speech. Shared meals rebuilt trust and made strangers into neighbors over simple bowls and shared tables most days. Commuting reshaped evenings as jobs clustered where buildings were ready. People left earlier and came home later, and dinner moved deeper into the night. Bus routes adjusted to new demand and added stops near clinics and schools. Bicycles filled racks outside libraries and small groceries. Carpools became text threads that started before sunrise. Parents learned to stagger shifts so one adult could make appointments. Weekends balanced repairs and rest. The pace was slower than before, but it held. A family could plan and keep most plans. That steadiness let children settle and gave elders a measure of peace, too. Public safety adjusted to neighborhoods that were rebuilding in pieces. Officers walked more beats and used bikes to reach blocks where cars could not pass. Street lights were fixed in clusters so routes felt safe again. Youth programs kept late hours for students whose homes were crowded or far from friends. Neighbors formed phone trees and checked porches when mail piled up. Courts reopened with attention to fairness and to the strain that displacement had caused. Trust improved through steady presence and through language that matched action. Safety grew from relationships that were renewed with careful work in many small ways. Faith communities carried people through weeks that felt unsettled. Pastors and imams preached about patience and about neighborly duty. Synagogues hosted health fairs that partnered with clinics for screenings. Choirs rehearsed in halls that still smelled of paint and plaster. Weddings took place in courtyards with strings of lights, and christenings filled small chapels. Funerals were gentler as time passed and as distance shrank. Volunteers drove elders to appointments and gathered groceries for families still repairing. The calendar turned to familiar feasts, and attendance rose. Spiritual life steadied daily life by keeping people connected to promise and to practice together. Children adapted with resilience that surprised adults and teachers. Libraries became safe rooms where students joined homework clubs and learned new software. Counselors visited classrooms and helped with transitions after long absences. Summer programs focused on swimming, first aid, and storm awareness, along with books and math. Teenagers found jobs that supported families while school schedules settled. Coaches looked for signs of stress and gave clear routines. Art teachers let students draw the houses they missed and the streets they hoped to see again. Small victories in class and on stage rebuilt confidence in slow but real steps for many. Storytelling helped people understand change and hold on to lessons. Local journalists covered permits, meetings, and milestones with stubborn attention. Podcasters recorded interviews on porches and in kitchens where decisions were made. Photographers documented cleanup and homecomings in careful frames that respected privacy. Film festivals set sections for shorts about recovery and the lives of workers. Teachers assigned oral histories and kept archives in binders that would survive another outage. People came to value clear facts and calm timelines. Information turned fear into action by showing steps and people who could help. That habit improved decisions across homes and offices. Small businesses adjusted to new risk and new demand. Owners learned to keep backups off-site and to maintain cash reserves when possible. Insurance policies were read with care, and brokers explained coverage in plain language. Shops stocked batteries, tarps, and chargers year-round. Contractors trained apprentices who would stay for careers rather than seasons. Tourism returned in waves as rooms reopened and festivals found dates again. Visitors were invited to spend with respect for the work still underway. Each receipt supported wages and repairs. The local economy recovered in layers that matched block-by-block progress across many patient months. Preparedness became part of ordinary talk because Hurricane Katrina had shown how limits stack. Families kept binders with contacts, copies, and routes. Neighborhood groups practiced phone trees and checked who needed rides. Apps delivered alerts, yet people still trusted radio and local voices. Employers updated plans so pay would continue during evacuations. Hospitals ran blackout drills that included manual lifts and paper orders. Schools rehearsed sheltering and early dismissal. Faith leaders kept lists for wellness calls. The lessons from Hurricane Katrina turned abstract risk into steps that anyone could take with neighbors and with calm practice in every storm season. Art and memory work carried forward as families returned and as streets regained their rhythm. Exhibits showed photographs from days before Hurricane Katrina and from the long rebuild that followed. Writers collected testimonies about long rides, quiet courage, and small kindness. Teachers set aside time each year to read names and recall what neighborhoods endured during Hurricane Katrina. Anniversaries drew neighbors to levees and church halls for music, food, and simple thanks. The city did not pretend risk was gone. It lived with water and with wiser tools. In that understanding, daily life found its balance and looked toward meaning. Hurricane Katrina lives in American memory as a turning point that reshaped how risk, care, and belonging are understood. It sits with other national shocks and still feels close to daily life. People remember brown water lines, attic cuts, and the sound of rotors passing over roofs. They remember long lines for buses and the relief of a cool room far from home. They remember neighbors who shared boats and food. The event became a teacher that spoke in plain examples. Plans matter, time matters, trust matters. Memory keeps those lessons near so they are not lost when seasons feel calm. Anniversaries help hold the story together without making it heavy. People walk levees, visit markers, and stand for moments of quiet where water once stood. They bring flowers to plots and tools to porches. Museums display photographs and careful maps. Schools invite elders to speak about leaving, waiting, and coming home. Families keep small boxes with rescued papers and keys. Cities ring bells and read names in calm voices. Each ritual is simple and clear. The work is to remember with care and to honor those who carried others. In that practice, memory stays useful and human. Through the years, Hurricane Katrina taught that protection must be a system and not a set of parts. Walls, pumps, gates, soils, and wetlands either work together or fail together. Designs need room for error, and time needs room for maintenance. Sensors, backup power, and trained crews turn plans into performance. Maps must show depth, and ground must be tested often. When the landscape shifts, standards must rise with it. Stronger barriers matter only if drainage can keep pace. Elevation helps only if voices can warn and roots can move people quickly. A city breathes through its water. That breath must be steady. Hurricane Katrina showed that governance works best when roles are simple and rehearsed. Local knowledge must lead, state resources must join fast, and federal capacity must scale what works. Redundant communications keep command real when towers fail. Prearranged missions shorten forms and put aircraft, buses, and trucks on the move. Registries for people who need help leaving protect those without cars. Shared maps keep responders from doubling work while streets are still wet. Clear briefings reduce rumor and save time. Cooperation grows when leaders stand in the same room and speak in plain words about tasks that can start today. Hurricane Katrina made equity a central measure of readiness. Plans that assume a car, a credit card, and a spare room will miss the people who most need help. Fair evacuation requires public pickup points, pet-friendly shelters, and clear support for nursing homes and group homes. Warnings must reach renters, workers on night shifts, and people who speak other languages. Cash assistance must arrive fast for food, fuel, and medicine. Recovery dollars must follow damage and need, not property value. A city that protects its most limited households protects everyone, because weak links decide how a hard week feels. Hurricane Katrina widened the idea of public health. Mold, heat, silence, and distance all left marks that lasted. Long care needs steady clinics, open pharmacies, and counselors who can meet people where they live. Hospitals must keep fuel safe and records backed up. Mobile units must reach neighborhoods when roads are slow. Employers should plan for time off that protects pay. Schools should watch for stress that hides in quiet students. Faith leaders can keep lists for wellness calls. The measure of success is not a briefing. It is sleep, breath, and the strength to return to a routine safely. Hurricane Katrina also taught how strong a civic fabric can be when neighbors act. Volunteers formed boat lines, kitchens, and tool banks, then kept those bonds through years of repair. Diaspora ties stayed alive through calls, remittances, and visits that carried skills home. Culture traveled and returned with new friends. Faith groups partnered across cities and lowered barriers between congregations. The storm showed that trust grows from work shared at eye level. Future plans honor that truth when they invite local groups to lead, fund them early, and keep them close to decision tables long after headlines move on together. Hurricane Katrina now sits inside a larger climate picture that communities study with care. Warmer water can feed stronger storms. Heavier rain can flood places far from any coast. Sea levels rise and raise the base for surge. Cities respond with higher codes, new pumps, greener streets, and coastal projects that rebuild marsh. Some places add buyouts where repeated losses are too great. Others lift homes or move critical buildings to higher ground. People ask hard questions about insurance, land use, and fair retreat. The lesson is steady. Prepare well, adapt early, and let science and lived experience work together. Hurricane Katrina left a simple household list that still holds value. Keep copies of documents and important numbers in a safe place. Store water, medicine, and food that do not need power. Plan rides for those who cannot drive. Share keys with someone you trust. Charge early and keep a small radio and a light with fresh batteries. Know the nearest pickup point for buses and the route to higher ground. Check on elders and on those who live alone. Write a plan on one page. Practice once before the season turns. Calm steps taken early save strength later everywhere. Hurricane Katrina also changed how stories should be told during crisis and after. Accuracy must travel faster than rumor. Reporters need clear access to officials and to neighborhoods. Officials need joint briefings that admit what is unknown and correct mistakes quickly. Photographs should respect dignity and context. Data should be shared in open formats so volunteers can help map needs. Survivors should be heard as experts on their own streets. When coverage centers service and fact, trust grows across distance. That trust moves donations, policy, and patience. Words can carry care as surely as trucks carry water in hard seasons. Hurricane Katrina pushed business and government to plan for continuity that keeps people paid and supplied. Employers created remote payroll and flexible leave, so evacuations do not break households. Hospitals built vendor networks with backups. Grocers set contracts for generators and fuel. Schools kept rosters current and shared buses across districts when needed. Insurers revised models and states reviewed consumer protections. Ports planned alternate yards and routes. Small lenders taught families how to build emergency savings. These steps are quiet and practical. They help turn a city from fragile to sturdy. Work resumes when rain stops and roads clear again. Hurricane Katrina remains a teacher because it turns attention toward people first. Protect the child, the elder, the worker on the night shift. Protect the nurse in the stairwell and the driver on the last bus. Build walls and pumps that match the water that is coming. Build networks that move, help without waiting for perfect lines. Keep stories honest so they comfort and guide. Carry photographs and phone numbers. Share a boat when needed and a table when the day is quiet again. The country keeps faith with those memories by doing the next calm thing well. Together always.